Right, welcome everyone. Welcome to our webinar on environmental fundraising. It's a two-parter this week. We've got part one today, part two on Thursday. You're all very welcome. I know that this is a very important subject. The reason that we scheduled these webinars on fundraising was because the feedback that I got after the first batch of webinars, when I asked people what other topics they wanted, the most common thing that came out was about environmental fundraising. So here we are. I know this is a very busy slide. This is our packed program of webinars that we've got this autumn. There's pretty much one every week, so hopefully there'll be something for everybody joining this call. We're here at the one that's coloured in, part one of our environmental fundraising opportunities today. Part two on Thursday is how to start fundraising, more of the practicalities. We've got sessions on schools, heat pumps, conservation pitfalls, the faculty system and how to navigate it, the topic around embodied carbon in our building projects. We're repeating our eco-church series. So we've got 3 eco-church webinars, one on getting started, one on working towards an award and gathering momentum, and one on how it links with net zero. And we've got a brand new series of webinars because it's currently the season of creation. So we've got a series of webinars themed around that, one on Forest Church, one on the theology of climate change, one on let all creation sing, how to build into your worship and prayer, and finally climate action is mission. When I've finished doing the housekeeping, I'll put links in so that you can find where those webinars are and book onto them. And it'd be great to see you at some more of our topics. Right. In terms of the housekeeping today, as usual, if you've come along to one of these webinars, we use the Q&A function for your questions rather than the chat. So if you move your mouse around, you'll find the Q&A. That's where to type your question. And you can also put a thumbs up next to anyone else's question that you see that you think actually hits the spot. And the ones with the most thumbs up will move to the top. So when Andrew and I break from the slides in order to look at the Q&A, we'll see the questions that have come to the top, and those are the ones that we're likely to take first. After both of the topics, so after Tuesday and Thursday have both happened, I will send the slides from both topics to everyone who's registered, and also a link through so you can tell us how good the webinars were and whether they were helpful. And once the recordings have been processed, we'll get them up on our website on the webinars page so that you can watch them again or send them to colleagues. And I just wanted to point out that normally our webinars are an hour, but the fundraising is such a meaty topic. We've made both topics an hour and a half. I know that might mean that some of you have to drop out after an hour if you're doing this in your lunch break, but hopefully most people have booked for the hour and a half and will stay with us till the end. Right, let's get on to the main event. So if you've come to one of our webinars before, you'll have come across me. I'm Catherine Ross, and I'm one of the staff who work on the Church of England's Environment Programme. I'm based in the Cathedral and Church Buildings Division. But more importantly, we have Andrew Evans. So Andrew is a senior consultant with Philanthropy Company, the fundraising consultancy. He's a very experienced fundraising director and consultant. He's secured large 7-figure donations from individual donors, from grant makers across churches, arts and heritage, health and community development. And he's worked, included in that is environmental projects such as LED lighting and insulation when re-roofing a building. He's also got a very strong personal commitment to environmental sustainability, including supporting his own church to secure its Gold Eco Church Award. So you are in safe hands today to learn more about environmental fundraising. Let me stop sharing my screen, and that will let Andrew get his slides up, and then we will get going.
Great. Thank you very much, Catherine, and welcome everybody. It's absolutely great to be here. Thank you so much for joining the webinar. And hopefully also Thursday's webinar. I hope you'll find them really useful in understanding the fundraising context and then some of the practicalities for environmental projects. As Catherine said, my name's Andrew. I'm an associate fundraising consultant with Philanthropy Company. I've worked in fundraising for a long time, basically ever since I decided, having done a law degree, that I did not want to be a lawyer. No offense to anybody who chose differently. Work for a huge variety of different causes in fundraising, including churches, and I've done some of most types of fundraising that we're going to talk about today. So events, community fundraising, big grants from governments, all that kind of stuff. I guess also relevant to this is that I've also been a minister and a church leader. I planted and pastored some churches in Liverpool for about 10 years. And has raised money, as it were, from your side of the fence for staffing and buildings and other projects in churches that I've been to. I'm currently a member of the PCC at St Michael's Church in Newton, Chester, so I'm at least a bit familiar with what it's like. I was trying to think of a word for this because I was going to say at the coalface, and that felt like really not very appropriate for a webinar on environmental fundraising. But anyway, you know what I mean. So that's me. I'm going to share my screen now if I can make that work, which I probably can't. That one. Catherine's going to wave at me if that's working.
It's coming. There we go.
Great. So now I need to be here and change the slides. So that's me. You've already seen me. Philanthropy company who I work with, at least some of the time, has a huge breadth of clients who do all sorts of different things. So if there are things that we talk about, particularly I think on Thursday's session, that we might be able to help you with, especially perhaps if you're a bigger church or a diocese, but also we work with all sorts of even very little charities as our clients, doing a whole range of consultancy just to help people with their fundraising and their planning for fundraising. So that's those are some of our kind of clients. We do all sorts of stuff, so campaigns for big building projects, like working with people to work out who they're going to approach for funding, helping find staff for fundraising, all that kind of stuff. Anyway, enough about all that. Let's move on to what we're really about here. So 2 webinars. And I thought I would talk through what we're going to do in both of them. There's probably not that much point talking through in great detail the left-hand column there, what we're doing today, because we're about to do it, so we'll just crack on. But I would like to tell you a bit more about what we're going to do on Thursday, which I hope you'll be able to come to or watch the recording of. So whereas today's focus is kind of overviewy and understanding the context and how environmental fundraising is and the kinds of types of funding you might want to be looking for. And I guess particularly if you're relatively new to or inexperienced in fundraising, today is essential background. And I was just saying to Catherine as we started, my slight fear or concern is that people might get to the end of today and feel like, well, what wasn't quite kind of practical enough. And I totally get that. And that's really, really where we're going on Thursday. But if you're not an experienced fundraiser, please do stick with us for today, because it does give you the essential background to understand the things we're then going to talk about in more pragmatic detail about making applications and planning a strategy and stuff on Thursday. So what we're going to do then is plan a fundraising strategy for environmental projects. So think about the tools and the kind of resources you need, how you're going to communicate your particular project, some different styles of approach for the different types of funder that we'll be thinking about today, and sort of common challenges and pitfalls and things that people get wrong. So the 2 things are really designed to kind of dovetail together to make a single whole for you in terms of thinking about environmental fundraising. And I hope that some of the stuff we talk about today might, even if you don't already have a very strong, clear environmental project in mind for fundraising, help you if you've got an hour or so to sit and ponder and think between now and Thursday to kind of clarify that a little bit in your mind so that you're more ready to go. So that's where we're going to be going today and also on Thursday. So our objectives for today, it's always good, isn't it, to know what your objectives are for learning. That's all the teachers do these days at the beginning of their lessons. I think it's very helpful, is to understand the fundraising landscape for environmental projects in parish churches. I think most of you are in parish churches looking at the list of who's here, and also other connected church settings. And then understand the range of types of funding for those sorts of projects and the sort of mix of funders you might want to put together to fundraise for an environmental project in your church. So that's what I hope we'll have achieved by the end of the session. And you can tell me whether we've done that or not. And if we haven't, then we'll make sure we pick those things up in Q&A at the end. Well, I'm going to stop a couple of times as we go through for Q&A. So if you've got a question at any point, stick it in the Q&A. If we're going to sort of cover it later, we'll just tell you we're covering it later, but it'll enable us just to break it up a bit, because I'm aware that it's a hot day. We've got quite a long time until 1:30, and you probably don't just want to listen to me for sort of 70 minutes and then have 20 minutes break. So we'll break it up with the Q&A as we go along. So let's crack on then with today. What do we mean by environmental projects? So what sorts of things are we talking about fundraising for? Well, it could be a pretty wide range of things. So an environmental project really is any project designed to have a positive impact on the natural environment. And that might include, but by no means be limited to, so sorts of things it might cover are things like solar panels and heat pump installations. I guess they're probably top of lots of people's lists. Insulation work, so perhaps a bit more sort of ordinary and everyday, but also clearly having an environmental impact. Promoting biodiversity, so that's, I guess, a less carbon related one. Environmental education, so that's a little bit of a sidestep, but improving people's knowledge of green issues, and obviously both historically and today the church still has incredibly important educational function in the wider culture and world. And the greening of transport, obviously one of the things about churches is that people come to them, and therefore cycling to church, electric car charging points, all those sorts of things. So all of those, I think, could be included in the overall heading of environmental projects. And as we'll see on Thursday, there are funders who will fund all of those different things and more, and we'll talk about the range of different projects. Different funders have different priorities, and almost certainly, whatever your project is, it will appeal to some kinds of funder and some specific funders and donors, and not to others. So we're going to have to be cognizant of that. Before you start raising funds for a project, and this feels very basic, but it happens very often, people start raising funds for things where they don't really know what the thing is. So having a specific project in mind is absolutely essential before you start fundraising. I think that's even true if you're fundraising inside your own congregation. So actually asking people just to give money to the church is not ever a very helpful way, I think, of getting funding, because people really want to know what it is that they're giving to. So having a specific project in mind, for example, we want to replace our aging boiler with electric pew heaters, check, specific project, and knowing what that project is going to cost. And one of the things we'll see on Thursday is that most larger funders are going to expect you to have multiple quotations and a preferred contractor for whatever the thing is before you make an application. And even if you're raising funds from individuals, again, even from within your own church congregation, very, very much easier to do it, easier to know where you're going, easier to get the target, easier to know when you've met it, if you know exactly how much it is going to cost to do whatever that is. Now, it may well be that you're here today and you've got some ideas about projects that you might kind of want to do that for, but you're not at that stage yet. You don't have costs, you haven't nailed down the details. That's absolutely fine. Talk a lot more about that on Thursday. And the information that you will need to have before you start trying to do the fundraising, and there'll be some checklists and all that kind of thing. So that's what we mean by environmental projects, and you need to define those, your specific one, more tightly before you start fundraising. Now, one of the things that most of your more formal funders, so things like government funding, trusts and foundations that you'll have heard of, they're going to be most interested in the impact that you're going to have with your project when you make an application. What difference is your project going to make in the world? And we're going to talk a lot more about working out impact of particular projects when you're applying for funding on Thursday. But for today, I'd like to set that in context for us by helping us to understand the big picture, if you like, of impact and the environment and environmental projects. So impact is a key word. Now, as you'll have gathered from the previous slide, environment covers a wide variety of things which are really quite different from each other. So biodiversity, quite different from carbon reduction in lots of ways. Okay, you can't measure them against each other. How would you know that spending £100 on one, what should that buy you in terms of the other one? It's quite complicated. And even amongst massive real experts and very serious scientists, there's disagreement about which solutions are best for the environment overall. To take an example that's now become a bit dated, but is quite pertinent. Diesel cars were way, way better than petrol cars from a CO2 emissions point of view. But they were much worse from an air quality point of view. So which one was better or worse? If you're doing an environmental project, would you replace diesel with petrol or petrol with diesel? Well, of course, we've all moved on from that, and we've realized that electric and clean electricity is better than both. But it's not always simple to work out what the impact of something is and if it's the best thing overall. So to try and simplify just a little bit for the purposes of our webinar, we know there is a stated priority of the Church of England, the resolution passed in General Synod, to be carbon net neutral. That is, to not emit any more carbon than we are absorbing as a church by 2030. We're going to try and focus in this session really in our examples and illustrations on projects that are trying to achieve that goal. Now, that doesn't mean there are other environmental projects that absolutely are, and lots of the things we say will be relevant to them. So there's loads, you could do a great project that only makes a tiny marginal contribution to the net zero goal, like a clean water project or a biodiversity project. And of course, there's also lots of things you can do that will make a massive difference to CO2, but won't actually help meet the Church of England's target. So, for example, this is an interesting one, some of you will have thought of this, no doubt. If everyone in your church who drives to church suddenly started walking or cycling, that would hugely cut CO2 emissions. But it wouldn't actually count towards the target, because technically, apart from the vicar, the CO2 of getting to church is your CO2, not the Church of England's CO2. Okay, so what that all means is it's really important to understand, for the purposes of reaching this target, which we think is important, which we've all come together as a church to say, yes, this is something we're definitely going to do. We think it's something we have a collective responsibility for. Where does my church's CO2 come from? And you're probably thinking, hang on a minute, I thought you said this is about fundraising, Andrew. Well, it absolutely is. And the truth is, there's no way that your church is going to get to net zero without somebody spending some money. And whether that's your money, your congregation's money, or a funder's money, everybody should want to know, well, how much CO2 are we getting rid of for every pound we're spending? Are we really getting the maximum bang for our buck? And you should care just as much about that if it's money from the government or money from a trust as you do if it's money from your congregation. Okay, we want to reduce the most CO2 we can for the limited pounds that we've got. Okay. And that's really important when you're making applications for funding. So imagine for a moment that I, Andrew, I'm a big grant making trust. I'm making decisions about spending, I can give £100,000 to a church to help reduce their CO2. I get an application from a church for a great project, and it's going to reduce their CO2 by 10 tonnes a year. And it's £100,000. And then I get another project from this other church over here that's going to reduce their CO2 by 100 tonnes a year for their £100,000. Well, guess which one I'm going to fund if I'm that grant maker. So before you create a project, before you apply for your money, you really need to understand the data. What's it actually going to do? What's the impact in CO2 terms, or if it's a biodiversity project in biodiversity terms? And then you need to work out, well, is that the right project, or will we be better doing something else first? So how then do you decide that? Well, fortunately, Catherine and her team produce loads of really great resources to help you to do this. And you should absolutely, if you've not already, watched those webinars, read those web pages, you should totally go and do that. But we know that the biggest carbon producers in churches, and it's true in the Church of England and all other churches, are heating, lighting, travel, though it doesn't necessarily fall in, but people getting to church is a big issue for carbon. Goods, so stuff that we have, whether that's electrical appliances or crockery or furniture, making those things produces CO2, and the embedded carbon that's in our buildings. Now, 3 of those, from a kind of funding point of view, they're pretty easy to deal with. And with some small exceptions, like maybe a grant for a bike rack around the transport thing, you're not going to get any funding to help you to deal with them particularly, or not very much. Okay, so embedded carbon in buildings, it's mostly there, and you're not going to get specific funding to help you alleviate that. Travel, most not going to get any funding to help you with that. And the stuff that we buy, most are not going to get any funding to help you with that. So let's deal with those really quickly, and then we'll move on to the other big 2. Okay, best way to help the planet around embedded carbon in buildings: don't build any new buildings unless you absolutely completely have to. So that nice new church hall you're thinking about, I'm having this discussion in my own church at the moment, so you know, I'm live for me, this discussion. That nice new church hall will probably emit more carbon dioxide from the concrete used in its foundations than several hundred transatlantic flights. Okay, so please don't build if you don't have to, and if you must build, build green, and particularly with as little concrete and steel as possible. They're the big CO2 emitters. And we have the slight irony, there are trust and foundations, you know, that will give you money to build a polluting building and then possibly also give you money to reduce the pollution. And if you could, yeah, anyway, you get the idea. So from a fundraising point of view, it's also great not to build a new building because you won't have to fundraise for it. Okay, so that's the buildings one. Now there are some things you can do, you know, if you must build, you may well be able to get extra grants and help from funders to build a greener building than you would otherwise have built. You should totally do that if you absolutely can. And then there's some stuff around insulation. We'll talk about that separately because it's really about heating. Okay, so that's buildings. Travel, as we've said, most travel, not technically part of the C of E's emissions, but obviously the environment does not care which carbon you save, whether it's your carbon or somebody else's carbon. So anything that you can get people walking, cycling to church, absolutely great. And most good combination solutions to this are a combination of carrot and stick, okay? And the carrot is possibly where there might be some grants, particularly from things like local councils, maybe your parish council or your town council might be able to help with this, local authorities, those kind of places. Things like putting bike racks outside your churches, maybe electric bike charging. So there's some carrot stuff that there may well be some grant funding for. Then there's also possibly some sort of what you might call stick stuff. So if you put your bike rack in an existing car park space, that might encourage people to walk to church because they have to park their car a bit further away, and then they might as well just walk in the first place. Okay. And there may be small grants available locally for things like bike rack if that's a project that you would like to do. The other thing is, if you've got a really big car park, you could consider something very radical like building some green houses on it and having less parking, and that will probably make people walk to church as well, and it would pay for itself because you'd have got some housing. Okay, so that's the second one. So transport, not loads of grants available to help with transport because that's mostly all about big solutions that government are doing. Third area that's really quick to deal with is stuff. Loads of the CO2 we each emit as individuals and as a church is embedded in the stuff that we use. And again, the simplest solution doesn't require any funding, also the cheapest solution, just don't buy stuff as a church if you don't have to. Because of course the sound system company, they'll tell you you have to have, you know, new speakers and new wires to go with your new sound desk. But just ask from an environmental point of view, every new thing I buy makes the climate crisis worse. Do we really need this? Do we actually have to do this as a church, or can we reduce, reuse and recycle? Okay, that leaves us with the big two, which are heating and lighting. Okay, so heating for most of us, I guess, probably gas in our churches. Some of us will have electric heating, most of us will be gas. Lighting, and I guess anything else you use electricity for. They are the biggies for churches in terms of environmental impact once your building has been built. And they are the ones where you will almost definitely need to spend some money in order to make a really big difference. But before you go to that spending money, you need to understand how much impact you're currently having on the environment from those things, and what difference could the project that you are proposing make. Okay, so before you do anything on these kinds of projects, if you haven't already, read the really brilliant 2-page guidance that Catherine and her team have produced, which kind of gives you an order to do things in, which from the sort of easiest and cheapest through to the most difficult and expensive. Read that and do it, and get an energy use audit. And there's loads of guidance on the Church of England website on how you go about doing that. Okay, please, please, please don't do any fundraising, especially from trusts and foundations and like formal funding or anything else that requires a formal application until you've done that piece of work and had the energy audit and worked out how much you're going to save in terms of carbon from doing this piece of work. Because if you haven't done that, you can't know that your project is the right one to do. And even if you think you do know that, you won't be able to prove it to anybody who asks you, and that's not going to help you to get funding. Okay, so that's like a very big introduction to this whole thing. If we've done all that, you're asking, okay, I've got that. So tell me, Andrew, answer the question, Andrew, what is the fundraising landscape for these kind of projects? Okay, and I'm not going to lie to you, it's not great. If you want a one-word summary, fundraising landscape for environmental projects in churches, it is tough to raise funds for these projects. It's tough. Okay, that does not mean that it is impossible. And we're going to spend all the rest of our time together over these 2 sessions showing you and thinking about how it can be done. But I would absolutely be doing you a disservice if I didn't tell you up front that it's quite hard. It's quite hard to raise money for these projects. Why, you ask me? Why is it so difficult? Like, this is the challenge of our generation. It's like, it's an existential crisis. Why is it so difficult to get funding to make it happen? Well, there's loads of reasons, but I'm just going to give you 3 that are quite important why it's difficult. So first reason it's really hard is COVID-19. Just as the world's attention was really beginning to turn to the climate emergency, and that was definitely happening in 2018 and 19, we know the climate emergency already killing 150,000 people a year through things like extra heat exhaustion, spread of malaria, those kind of things. Likely to be double that by 2030. So by 2030, climate emergency will be killing 300,000 people a year. And that's not even counting some of the things like flooding that might be attributable to it and it's always hard to tell specifically. Just when we're people are really getting to that as a big issue, this rotten virus turns up and kills 4.5 million people. And we're still adding 10,000 a day to that death rate, double what we were losing last year. It might not feel like it in Britain, but we're losing twice as many people a day to COVID around the world as we were last year. Not surprisingly, loads of funders turned their attention to coronavirus. So from big science research funders who are otherwise funding research into sort of science and climate change, to funders of community projects who might have been able to fund your solar panel project, but the money went to your food bank instead. That's the reality of COVID-19. It has massively created a problem with funding for environmental projects, and it will take us a few years to get back from that, I think. Second really big reason why this is difficult is our obsession with the urgent. Now, human beings are amazing, aren't we, at adapting to urgent demands, at learning new things quickly. And you want a breathtaking example of that, the COVID vaccines are. They're an astonishing piece of science, showing what people can achieve when they put their minds to it, not just developing them, but funding them and getting them out to people around the world. Not as great as we'd like, perhaps in some countries, but amazing. The trouble with that is we're always susceptible to putting our resources as human beings into things that seem urgent over things that are big long-term problems. Okay, example of that, British people from just the last week generously gave tens of thousands of pounds to fly 175 animals back from Afghanistan with pen farthing. An amazing thing to do, but literally millions of animals are dying from climate change, and we're probably giving much less money to that. Now, we should not blame people for what they give to, because it is generosity is a good thing. But we do need to recognise that the price of charities, and it often includes churches, spending decades exploiting the urgency of things, whether that's a tier fund with an urgent famine appeal, or your church with the urgent roof appeal. We exploit this idea of urgency to get people to give, but the trouble is it damages our ability to raise funds for truly humanity-threatening problems like climate change, which are incredibly important, but in a sense not urgent, because whatever we do today, the problem will still be with us. And we can't solve that problem today in the same way that we can solve a vaccine problem today. So our obsession with the urgent makes it hard. And then the third problem or difficulty is the Church of England's structure. I think most people out on the street, you go and ask 100 people, they have no idea that what we think of as the Church of England most of the time is actually 20,000 or so different legal organisations. So parishes and cathedrals and dioceses and schools, most of which are registered charities or exempt charities. And of course, we all know, if you're here today, we know there's loads of reasons for that in history. Some of them are good reasons, some of them not so good reasons. But in terms of funding big structural change, it does just make it much harder to do the kinds of things we're wanting to do today, funding environmental projects. To help you sort of see why that is, imagine I've been a grant maker, now I'm the government. Imagine that Andrew is the government. And I can give £100 million, let's say, to the National Trust. So they're an example of a charity, aren't they? Not entirely unlike the Church of England, lots of energy use, lots of old buildings. And if I give £100 billion to the National Trust for reducing carbon dioxide emissions, The National Trust can go, well, we're going to use this much of our land to build all these solar farms and these wind turbines, and I'm going to pick these 30 properties and we're going to install heat pumps in these 30 properties. And I can just tell whoever runs that particular property for me, my property manager, while you're having a heat pump. Now, can you imagine the Church of England getting £100 million and telling your parish that it's having a heat pump? There'll be arguments, there'll be letters to the local paper, it's going to be a mess, isn't it? Now, there are some good things about that. So you can get on with doing your fundraising, even if you feel like other people in your diocese or nationally are not doing what all that you would want them to, but it also makes it more difficult. Now, I'm telling you those three big reasons why it's tough, not to depress you and not because you can change them, because mostly they're pretty much outside our control, but just to give you a sense of why this is quite tricky. And also, I hope to give a bit of context or make sense of the advice I'm going to be giving on Thursday about how you approach different funders for these kind of projects, because these factors shape how you're going to make your case and make your argument for why somebody should give you money to do your heat pump or solar panels or whatever it is. Okay, so that's the fundraising scene. Okay, it's tough. In the light of that, then, I have one piece of advice, which is that you should start by trying not to fundraise. How to start your fundraising for an environmental project? The answer is try not to fundraise. We're going to go to the end of this slide and then I'm going to take some questions if there are any. So if you've got questions, now's a great time to stick them in the Q&A. Okay. Fundraising from charitable sources, whether that's donations from your congregation, from your community, from grant makers, from government, it's always difficult. It's always difficult because there's so many great causes out there and so much need and a finite amount of money in people's pockets. So I always recommend to any charity that I'm working with asking 4 questions to try and minimize the amount of money you need to raise. Now, it may be that some of you have got a project fully formed and you've already done this and that's fantastic. But if you haven't, this is a great thing to do. So first question, can we do this cheaper? Can we do this cheaper? The easiest money to raise is the money that you never spend because you don't need to do anything then. So to take an example of that, maybe you're in a grade 1 listed or grade 2 star listed building, putting solar panels on your roof, even if you can get the relevant permissions, unless you happen to be putting scaffolding up anyway for something else, it's going to be really expensive, really expensive. And it would almost certainly be more affordable just to switch to a green electricity tariff and have someone else install and run the solar panels in an underused field instead. Okay. And particularly with environmental projects, it's just so important to understand the financial planning. What's the goal? Because if I'm trying to save the biggest amount of carbon possible, then unless my church building is really intensively used, it's probably not by putting solar panels on my church, or even possibly by insulating my church a lot, unless it's used like multiple days a week. For many in our parishes, we'll reduce our carbon emissions in our parish more by funding work to better insulate a house that's lived in by a member of church staff and owned by the parish. And I know that's difficult with vicarages because of the diocesan ownership, or by installing solar panels on a house that's owned by a member of staff, but a youth worker, for example, than we will by putting them on the church building in terms of what we get in return for our money. Because remember, the planet doesn't care where the carbon comes from. The other thing that's worth thinking about in terms of cheapness is that loads of the technology for environmental improvements, and this is especially true of heat pumps, is quite new and it's falling in price quite quickly. So it might well be best to spend smaller sums now. Say you've got a church hall that could be better insulated, and that's a relatively cheap thing to do, often insulation, and then wait a year or two to spend a bigger sum on your heat pump, because the price will almost certainly have fallen. The technology will be more reliable and better tested because this is kind of some new stuff that's going on. So first question to ask, can we do it cheaper? Second question I always encourage churches to ask is, can we earn the money instead of raising it charitably? Now, I know this is difficult. I've experienced it myself, both as a church leader and as a church member. We're often really reluctant to charge anybody for anything on the basis that it might put people off coming, and we're all really keen for people to come to our church because we want them to experience all that we have to offer them in Christ and in our community. But interestingly, when you think about it, the things we do charge for as churches, weddings and funerals, are some of the most popular things that people choose to do in church. So that slightly undermines the argument that charging people puts them off, because on the whole, it doesn't seem that it particularly does. And I genuinely believe that if what you provide in your building is good, whether it's a church hall for hire, or a play group, or a men's breakfast, it is a great idea to charge those who can afford it at least as much as it costs you to run it. Because that way, you keep it free for those who can't afford it, and that's really important and good. And especially if you have a building, if you hire it out at a rate that is sustainable, you can use the money to maintain that building so actually the community still has a facility in the future. And again, particularly if you're in a village or a town with other community buildings, it's really important to charge any hire at least as much as other comparable community buildings, because otherwise you're just undercutting other charities' ability to keep afloat. So can you earn the money? There may be other ways that your church can earn money, again, particularly if you're in areas where other services have been cut. You may have facilities that could be turned into the shop or the post office or whatever. Can you actually do things that earn money? And the reason that works better is because the vast majority of people spend much more money on services and stuff than they give away, inevitably. So it's just a bigger pool of money to get from if you're earning the money. Third question that's really important to ask before you get into fundraising is, can this project pay for itself? And there's a whole bunch of environmental projects that really should cover their own costs, or at least partly cover their own costs over a period of time. Because one of the big things about environmental projects, as you'll know if you've been researching them, is that they have high upfront or capital costs and much lower running costs than sort of the fossil fuel equivalent. So, you know, your heat pump has a big capital cost, but actually is much cheaper to run than electric heaters in the church. So there's a bunch of stuff though that can cover its own costs. So pew heaters is one of my favorite examples, because pew heaters are amazing because they heat the people sitting on top of the pews, rather than heating all that air in the roof void that's above the nave. And I often sort of sit in cold churches and think, I bet it's really warm up there 30 feet above my head, but unfortunately I can't get there. So having things like pew heaters installed, even though you have to install them, the electricity they run on might be more expensive than the gas for your boiler. Because you're heating the right bit of the space, you might actually save quite a lot of money. Okay. Another example, trivial one, but worth thinking about. You buy your vicar an electric bike. If they ride that bike, rather than charge back to the church 45p a mile for their travel expenses, and they only do 10 miles a week on that bike, which is not very much, that will actually be cheaper over 5 years than just paying them their travel expenses for the car. Okay, so there are some things that they'll just pay for themselves and save lots of carbon. LED bulbs, obviously, is the example that everyone's familiar with. One church that I've been working with this year recently replaced it's a big church, but 1,000 light fittings cost about £22,000 to replace all their lights with LEDs, but they're saving more than £5,000 a year on their electricity bill from doing that. And they've basically therefore gone, we're going to take out a loan to fund the £22,000, and then we will repay that loan out of the savings that we're making. So dead easy to do. They've got better light, and it's basically not cost them anything. Fourth question to ask then, after can it pay for itself, is can we pay for this ourselves? It is so much easier to raise money from the people already connected to your church than it is to raise it from anybody else, because they already believe in what you do. You know, if someone's coming to your church week on week, they believe in what you do. Like, sometimes they might be a bit grumbly about it, you know, we can all be a bit grumbly about what we do, but basically you're there, you're committed to this. And we know that in the Church of England, across the board, average church goer giving is £6 a week, 1.2% of average earnings. Now, you might find that depressing. I think it's a great opportunity, because it means that even in difficult times financially, like the ones that, you know, many of us have been facing over the last 18 months, there is a lot of scope for people to give more if they choose to. So if you can capture their imagination or a really compelling reason to give, then you can actually raise quite a lot more money inside your own church. And one of the great things about environmental projects is that almost everyone is more aware than they were about the dangers of climate change and the need to do something about it. So if you can show folk in your church that your money will make a real difference, they may well be willing to give. And remember, you don't necessarily have to have all the money for your project up front. So if your congregation is willing to give an extra £1,000 a month for the next 4 years, it is highly likely that you will find someone, perhaps your diocese or even another member of the church, to lend you £50,000 interest-free to get your heat pump installed that can then be repaid from that giving. Okay, so whatever your project is, start with those 4 questions. Can we do it cheaper? Can we earn the money? Can it pay for itself? Can we pay for this ourselves? And once you have done that, now it's time to ask, who else might fund this? And that's the second half of our webinar. But before we get into that, let's take a break for any questions.
Right. So looking at the questions, the one at the top is about are there any funders who are interested in the scoping and consultation costs rather to help people work out what's feasible?
So basically, that is one of the hardest things to raise money for. So sort of scoping and consultation is always one of the most difficult things. And the reason for that is because, understandably, most external funders want you to kind of put something into this before they do. And obviously those scoping and consultation costs tend to come first. Having said that, and we will talk more about this on Thursday, where you've got a good relationship or can develop a good relationship with often a quite local funder, there may well be scope for paying for those sorts of costs for you up front. And generally that will be where the funder is really committed to you because they trust that you are like good-hearted and spend your money wisely and know what you're doing. So if you're, so for example, I live in Chester, and there are a number of grant making trusts in Chester. There's like 3 or 4 that fund lots of really great local projects in the city and the surrounding area. And if as a church you write to them, like that you'll almost certainly know somebody who's on one of those kind of trusts, you'll have a connection with them in your church. You meet them, you ring them up, you say, this is what we're thinking about doing. You develop a kind of relationship where they understand who you are and what your heart is, and you go, we're doing this, this, and this, but we really need £3,000 to pay for this. Then that's likely to happen. But your sort of bigger national funders, they really want you to have done that first. So we'll talk a little bit later about sort of lottery funding. Generally speaking, your lottery funding, they want you to have done all that kind of work before they get to the point where they fund it, unless it's a really enormous project with absolutely massive kind of cost to set it up. Like you're a cathedral and there's £100,000 worth of cost, you might get help towards that. But whatever, you'll have to put some of it in yourself, almost certainly.
The ones that came to mind for me were the MCS Foundation and the government's Rural Community Energy Fund. I think both of those will look at feasibility studies.
Yes, so MCS Foundation, who very generously sponsor these webinars and have kind of helped us with this. So they're fantastic. They do some of those kind of work, often not so much for it'd be harder to get it for an individual church. I think, again, lots of these things are about kind of clubbing together. So if you got together with 6 other churches in your deanery, say, and said, okay, we're going to do this together, can we raise some money to do it between us? And each of the churches puts in, £1,000, and then that might well be a more effective way of doing it, because again, funders want to see, are you being really effective? Is it really collaborative? Are you trying to think about the best way? So that 6 churches might go, actually, the way to save the most carbon is just to do something in these 2 of these 6 churches. Or it's like one of these churches has a field that we're going to put 1,000 solar panels in. And that's going to sort of help offset the carbon from all of those things, rather than as every man for himself. And funders don't love the every man for himself type approach, which is why the fragmentation of the structure of the Church of England is a little bit problematic, because it doesn't always lead to the most efficient solutions. So things that you can do to work with others are always really helpful in getting funding. Great point, Catherine. Thank you.
And the other thing that comes to mind is to get a church energy audit done, which are relatively low cost. So if you qualify for one of the subsidies, then it's £245 plus VAT to have a church energy audit done. And then that gives you at least the beginnings of that feasibility study that you need.
Absolutely. Yeah, and there's a really helpful webpage on that you can go to that tells you how to go about that process and do the application for it, isn't there?
I've put it in the chat.
Brilliant.
The next, so that is that one that we've done. What's next on the list? This might be more specific than you want to go into at the moment. The next one says, would enclosing part of a church so that a smaller space is heated and lit in the colder months be considered an environmental project by funders?
I think the answer to that is a definite yes, if you've got the sort of data to back up the fact that that is the impact that it's going to make. So if you can say, look, we've had an energy use audit done, and one of the recommendations that came back is that we lower the ceiling height by 20 feet, and that will reduce our energy bill by X. Then you can then make that case to funders, and we'll talk much more on Thursday about how you actually kind of write that out and make the case. But yeah, absolutely, anything that achieves the desired ambition is fine. So even if the thing looks like a quirky thing to do, if what it's achieving is significantly reducing your carbon emissions, and the floor that you're putting into your building isn't concrete and therefore undoing the good that it's doing, then that's absolutely fine. Yeah.
I'm picturing there's one of the eco churches that's got its gold award, which I've seen a photograph of, where what they've bought for the winter is they actually bought a little marquee that they put up inside the church, and they meet there in the winter. There can be imaginative solutions to some of these problems.
Excuse me 1 second, I'm going to close my window because somebody has just started mowing the lawn outside.
Perfect timing.
So I'm now going to be very hot, but at least it won't be noisy for you all.
The next question is quite a long question, to which I imagine the answer is yes. The question is, do you think that one of the challenges that churches and cathedrals face is that external funders may have the perception that the church is wealthy and that the commissioners should use their assets to fund the 2030 carbon neutral target through grants or interest-free loans?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I'm sure the answer to that is yes. I think it's not entirely. So certainly central government. So I've done quite a lot of work over the years with Department of Culture, Media and Sport, and they both the ministers and civil servants are. They're very aware of the reality of the situation. They don't believe that the church is wealthier than it is. I think trust and foundations, again, the bigger national trust and foundations. So we'll talk next time about people like the Garfield Weston Foundation, very big funder of churches. They know too that the church is not as rich as perhaps there's a public perception of. But smaller local trusts, absolutely, that may well be the case. Individual fund donors, we'll talk about that. They may well think that. And so part of your sell, if you like, is just explaining to people the reality of that situation, and that your individual parish church is not rich. And the great thing is you can show them your accounts and you can pretty much demonstrate that you're not rich. I think it's fair to say that the church commissioners are also very aware of this and are reviewing some of their things, and they have used a good amount of their assets to help with environmental things. And I understand that is likely to increase significantly over the next 10 or 20 years, because obviously the church commissioners are responsive to the general synod resolution. So I think there will be help with that. Again, structures of the Church of England make it not dead easy to work out how is that going to filter down to helping individual parishes. But certainly things like loans, I think, are likely to be a sort of feature. And one of the things that I've had some conversations with the church commissions about, working with big financial institutions, particularly so if you're from a cathedral, I think there are opportunities for things like bonds that might actually fund some of these things where there's a big upfront capital cost, but then some savings down the line that you could use to pay back a loan or a bond. But yeah, it is a problem. We'll talk about how you can address it a little bit next time.
How many more questions do you want at this break before we...
Should we take one more and then crack on with the next session?
There's a question from Richard. I'm interested in the connections here with the wider community usage of any space. Presumably you're more likely to be able to acquire external funding if you can demonstrate that the building is used throughout the week by a range of organisations, and the longer term that can then generate more significant savings.
Absolutely, yes, Richard, completely agree with that. Really brilliant point. So the more intensively used your building is, the more efficient it is from a carbon perspective. So although if you have, another 20 hours of use during the week, you will have the heating on for another 20 hours, and therefore at one level you'll be emitting more carbon, because there's a bunch of carbon embedded in the building, and a bunch of the sort of heating cost is effectively fixed, especially in our big stone churches. Actually, every time you heat the church, it retains quite a bit of it for quite a few days. Actually, the amount of carbon dioxide per person falls with the intensity of use, and the efficiency of installing big capital things like a heat pump or solar panels increases massively the more that you're using the building, because you're just using that asset a lot more. So the more you can do as a church to get more people into the space and use it more intensively in ways that are appropriate to what you want to do, absolutely the better, both from a sort of CO2 kind of effectiveness point of view, but also from a funder point of view, because actually most funders, even ones who fund capital works to buildings, they're not that interested in the building itself, even if it's a heritage building. Some are, but most are. They care about what happens in the building. And there will be obviously Christian foundation trusts that care about your worship and your community life as Christians together. But there's loads more trusts and foundations that care about how well are old people looked after in your community, what provisions are there for young people and children in your community, are there things for refugees and asylum seekers or ex-offenders. And churches, and I know this is hard to do because we all have loads of demands on our time, and lots of these things require volunteers to run them, but they're also, we're just brilliant places to deliver all of those services in communities, especially if you're in sort of smaller and more rural communities where there's just no other community building often that can deliver those things. So the more you can think creatively and not feel you have to run things, but just let someone else in to do something. So, if you've got other organizations that are struggling for space or whatever, absolutely let them have your building, work out what it realistically really costs to run it, only charge them that plus a little bit more, just so you've got a sustainable operation, and get those groups in, get people in to use your building. Absolutely brilliant. Great for the environment, great for the vibe and feel of your church, great for funding.
And where there are funders who say that they don't fund religious purposes, if you are, for example, fundraising for a church hall that has a whole mixture of community uses, can that still be eligible?
Absolutely. Yeah, and there are very few funders who won't fund churches at all as a category of organisation. There are lots and lots of funders who won't fund what we might loosely call worship activities. So they won't fund, prayers and services and, new kit for your altar or table, all those kind of things. But they will fund your church doing a youth group which is it's an open youth group to all the kids who live in your area, or they will fund your lunch club for older people, or your mums and tots work. Absolutely. And almost every charitable trust that I've worked with, they recognize, whatever their own personal views on Christianity and religion, the enormous good work that churches do in communities, making a difference for everybody without fear or favor. So yeah, very few. So if you see you're reading through, a bunch of grant makers and it says doesn't fund religious organizations, don't just stop, do a little bit more digging and go, but what if actually what we're doing isn't the religious bit, it's just that sort of community service. And if you're not sure, almost all trust and grant makers respond very positively to you ringing them up and just asking the question. They're really happy for you to do that. And also, if you then end up applying to them, it's really good because they remember, oh, that nice person from that church rang me up and they asked a question about this before they sent in the application, and that will only help your cause.
It's so linked. I'm going to sneak in the next thing on the list as well.
Go for it.
About parish councils. You mentioned about approaching parish councils, and somebody said that their experience with their parish council can't fund, their standing orders means they can't fund anything in relation to churches or churchyards.
That can be an issue. My recollection is, so please nobody hold me to this, that is not absolute universal. I think it does affect lots of parish councils. I think the thing that parish councils will often do for you is not directly fund you because they don't have that much money themselves, but it is put you into the network of other people that can fund you, particularly into the district council. So parish councils and town council have very strong relationships with the district council that sits above, and can often be that they can point you to the right officer or the right counsellor with the right portfolio to actually kind of get you into those places. So that's the main way that I would sort of utilize the connection with your parish council. And also often your interests will be really similar. So, you might be able to go, well, the parish council owns this hall here and it's next to the church here and there's this field in between, and we could do something with that around a ground source heat pump that actually heats both buildings and those kind of things. So like building those kind of really good relationships, which I know can sometimes be a bit strained, is really worthwhile investment of your time.
Okay.
Great. Thanks, Catherine. Let me go back to my share screen and you don't have to look at my face anymore. Share. Think that's working? Okay. Good question so far. I've done that. Okay, we are going to talk about 7 types of fundraising in the round over the rest of our time together, and then we will sort of explore the sort of details of making those work for you in the next session. So 7 types of fundraising. Number 1, individual donations. I'm just going to minimize the questions because they're sitting over my slide. Giving by UK households, so this is individuals, was £10.1 billion in 2019, so £363 per household average going to charity. That's remained more or less unchanged for the last few years. That is 4 times more than the amount of money given by grant making trusts. So individual giving, a much bigger thing than grants overall. However, it's also a decrease. So the proportion of households that are giving is falling. It was 69% in 2016, 65% in 2018. I think we'll see a pandemic blip, but I reckon it'll be down to about 60% by the middle 2020s, because a much smaller group of households are giving more money. So you've got this trend of fewer households giving anything, and some households, particularly at the sort of higher end of the income scale, giving more. Giving increases, perhaps not surprisingly, with age. 16 to 24-year-olds give the least, over 65s give the most. Those groups also have statistically the highest and lowest disposable incomes, so not really surprising. Perhaps a bit less intuitive is that women give much more often than men, but men's average gifts are larger. Nobody quite knows why that is, but that's a statistical quirk. Most people, so the biggest groups of donors, are for animal welfare charities. They're the single biggest recipient of, so 25% of people, I think, are to animal welfare charities, children and young people's charities, medical research, hospitals and hospices. But interestingly, religious organisations get more money than any of those. So religious organisations, churches, mosques, etc., have fewer larger donations than the average charity. And there is a lot of money given to religious organisations in Britain. Religious organisations get 10 times more money than arts and cultural organisations from individual donations. In the Church of England, some of you will know, there's £600 million given to Church of England parishes by individuals annually. And that has grown in cash terms every year from 2010 to 2019. So again, some of the sort of, all the decline of the church stories that you occasionally read in the media, certainly in terms of giving, not the case. It has fallen a little bit in real terms, so by about 0.5% a year after inflation. And worryingly, and some of you will know this from personal experience, and I feel for you, 48% of parishes don't have enough annual income to cover their expenditure in any given year. And 26% of all Church of England parishes are spending 10% more than their income annually. So they're spending 110% or more of what they're getting, which is obviously not sustainable. We haven't yet got great figures for the pandemic in terms of individual giving, but we know that it went up by 20% in the first few months, mostly to obvious things like food banks in the front line of providing relief. And in most churches, giving's held up okay from what we can tell. So mostly falls in income through the plate, and those sort of cash gifts obviously did fall off, not so much the standing orders, have been partly offset at least by reduced costs and use of the furlough scheme and those kind of things. And it seems pretty likely the trend of charitable giving is going to be flat in the medium term. So trust in charities remains low. Lots of people suffering post-pandemic squeezing their incomes. Like it's a worrying time. What about environmental projects and parishes? If you're a parish church or a church school, almost every environmental project is going to involve individual giving. When you're doing your list of the types of giving we're going to have for our project, This must be part of your plan, okay? Because no other donor, whether they're a grant maker or another person in your town or village, they're going to want to be assured that the church members are behind your project. Those who come regularly are behind it, and they've demonstrated it by giving. Okay, so you absolutely need financial commitment within your church to whatever your project is. Okay, and I think one of the challenges that so often, I don't know about you, my experience of those, a parish general meeting, and you look at the budget and it's boring, isn't it? The budget's boring. The budget has lines like staff costs and equipment costs, which is just not, it's not inspiring, is it? Okay, so there's a great opportunity with an environmental project to show people in the church, who are put off by the spreadsheet of money, here's an amount of money, here's what it's going to pay for, here's the difference it's going to make. And making an environmental project, say you make it the center of your parish gift day, could really help raise more money, not just for that project, but just more generally. Because if people in your church are reminded we've got a clear vision, a vision for a just and sustainable world, a world for our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, we've got a confidence about our church's relevance, we're going to put a heat pump and solar panels here because we're still going to be here in 50 years' time and those things are still going to be important. We're going to have continued ministry for the future because environmental projects are all about the future. Like, actually, that can really help. It can inspire people, and inspired people are much more likely to give. Because there's something to give to. But it's not just individuals in the church who may be interested in supporting. So particularly if your project's very visible or it's of obvious benefit to the wider community. So I'd say you've got a beautiful space in your churchyard that you're going to rewild a little bit, that loads of people can come and visit. Like, you may well be able to get donations from people who don't attend the church, but are supportive of this aspect, at least, of your mission. It's particularly true, I think, if you're here and you're a rural church or a church in a small community. Like, absolutely enlist all of the kind of, constituents in your area, whether that's the pub, the shop, the post office, the sports club. Get all of those people to join in and help you with the sort of fundraising, and then help them when it's their turn to have their own fundraising project. So individual fundraising absolutely must be part of your plan. Need financial commitment in the church. Also opportunities in your local community just to engage other people who might give, particularly where your church is felt to be a valuable community asset. So where you do lots of things, question that we had in the previous Q&A, the more things you do, the more different people who come in, the more likely people are to go, absolutely, we're going to, write a standing order for that. I'm going to put £20 in the bucket. There's an increasing number of digital platforms. We'll talk a bit more in detail about some of them in the next session, that are really good for helping publicize your project and also making it easy for people inside or outside your church to give. And that's connected to all those things that you've probably heard more about during the pandemic. So some of the online fundraising things, some of the contactless donation points where people can use cards to give, all of that kind of stuff. In terms of cost, fundraising from individuals is generally quite low cost, because most of the stuff that you do to ask people, whether that's setting up a crowdfunding platform online, dropping leaflets through doors in your parish, running a church gift day, is mostly done by volunteers. So it's just the time really that it costs. Individual giving works potentially for almost any kind of project. It depends what the project is, which individuals you're asking, but and it has a really high success rate. So if you're raising money from individual donations, you might not raise all that you hope, but you will almost certainly raise something. So you won't be left with nothing at the end of it. So individual donations, really important, definitely should be part of your plan. Slightly more perhaps tricky or different is events. Events fundraising has existed for hundreds of years. I guess we think it's a classic church fete type thing. It's been going on a very long time. Events have raised millions of pounds for churches over the years and for their ministries. But events are also quite culturally significant. So the photo on the slide there, there were these two guys called John and Paul. They met at a church fete in 1957 and went on to form a moderately successful pop group called the Beatles. So, events, who knows what could happen if you have an event. Anyway, events obviously massively hit by the pandemic, but they're definitely coming back. And I think over the next year or so, there is going to be absolutely loads of demand, wherever you are, big city, small town, rural village, for fairs and quiz nights and music events and sports events and more. People, you see this, don't you, just going out, being around the place, cafes and shops, lost it. People want to be together again. They want to do things again. And I think particularly they want to do things with purpose and with heart and meaning. So now is a great time to be thinking about doing some events that might raise some money. They're great for raising awareness of your appeal in your wider community, and they can often entice people to support your environmental project who are not part of your church congregation, who might not give to it, they might not give to a straight appeal that you kind of put through their door, but they might welcome to an event that you're running as a church. However, events are time consuming and costly to organise. So for most events, 50 to 90% of the income is going to go on the cost of running the event, and then you're going to be left with a profit. So it's a bit more like running a business. There's a cost and there's a profit at the end. And there's always a risk with an event of making a loss because you've got some costs and might not get it back. And that's particularly true for big events such as balls and dinners and those kind of things. And at the moment, especially given some of the continuing uncertainties around COVID, you might want to hold those off at least for another few months until everything's a bit more certain again that it's not going to get cancelled. But most events do make significant profits. They mobilise all sorts of volunteers who might not get involved in other types of fundraising. Definitely worth thinking about. My one word of caution around environmental projects is you just need to think through what kind of event am I going to have and how does that fit with the sort of project that we're trying to do. So a carbon reduction project where the event involves loads of people driving 20 miles to a nice hotel for a ball, or a biodiversity project fundraising event where you use loads of disposable plastic might not be the look that you're wanting. So just think really carefully about, is the type of event we're doing and the things that the impact the event has, do they sort of fit and dovetail nicely with the message that we're trying to share about what we're actually doing in the project? Okay, so that's just a little kind of sidebar for events there. Third type of fundraising you might want to consider in your kind of matrix of how we're going to fund our project is major donors. There's no agreed definition of what constitutes a major donor, but in the UK, it's often considered to be one-off gifts, that's before tax relief or gift aid or whatever, of £5,000 or more. And I think that's a sensible level for churches to begin to think differently about gifts. So, where people are giving £5,000 as a one-off, more than about sort of £400 or £500 a month or something, it's begin to just think a little bit differently about how you look after and steward those donors. Now, we live in Britain, don't we, with quite high and often justified suspicions about the wealthy. But it's worth saying the tax system in the UK doesn't provide any particular incentives to rich people giving more. Okay, so this is not quite true in other countries, particularly in the United States. Nobody in the UK can get back more in tax relief than the amount that they give in donations. It's not possible in the way that UK law works. Okay, and that means the motivations of big donors when they're surveyed, people who are giving £10,000, £1 million, they're actually much the same as other donors. So key motivations are surveyed recently. Feeling my money will make a difference. 74% of rich donors said that was a major donor, so that was important. Being already interested in the cause, 74% again. Fitting with my predetermined giving objectives, 73%. And being asked by someone I know and respect, 69%. Now, there's not much you can do about number 3. Someone's predetermined what they're giving to, and they've done that. You can't change that. Probably limited scope to change number 2, that you can over time make people more interested in what you're doing. But there's absolutely loads you can do about number 1, feeling my money will make a difference, and number 4, being asked by someone I know and respect. And then we'll cover more of those, about how you make the ask thing, on Thursday. In terms of the big picture, major donor giving has been increasing for years, not surprisingly, because the number of quite or very wealthy people in relative to others has also increased significantly over the last 30 years. Now, for environmental projects in an individual parish, so if you're an individual parish, major donors are most likely only to give to the parish where they live or the church where they attend. So this is definitely a type of fundraising to pursue if your parish is a relatively wealthy kind of area. Okay, now that does not mean you need to be in Mayfair. You don't need to be in, I don't know, Brompton or Kensington or somewhere. Okay, most suburban and rural parishes in England and those in central London have numbers of well-off people in them. So it's just about thinking, well, where might those people be and how can we connect with them in a, not in a cynical way, in a genuinely interested in them, are they genuinely interested in giving kind of way. Major donor fundraising is very cost effective. It generally doesn't cost anything other than the investment of your time in doing a bit of research into who you might ask and taking some time to get to know them, to talk to them about what you're doing and to ask them. So it's very cost effective. It doesn't have, there's no sort of, like an event, you don't have to sort of spend lots of money doing it, but it is slow. So it often takes years to cultivate a new major donor, and it has relatively high risk because you're probably putting quite a bit of effort into quite a small number of people, and it may be just on the law of averages that none of them end up giving. Okay, so major donor fundraising, most suitable for bigger projects, and donors are often really keen to give to capital projects with a long lifespan, and that's a big plus for environmental projects. Major donor funding is often about kind of legacy, even if it's not formally our legacy, but it's about people creating something that lasts beyond them. And environmental projects are all about investing now for the future, aren't they? And a bunch of major donors really increasingly interested in environmental issues, and there are some mega philanthropists like the Hewlett family, think Hewlett Packard, the printers, the Rousing family, they're the guys who invented Tetra Pak, Goldsmith family, they're really big into environmental funding, and that means many smaller scale philanthropists who are kind of interested in this are also thinking about what they can do in that area. So if you're in a kind of relatively prosperous place, this is definitely something to consider. Legacies. Now, most of us can't afford to make major gifts, those £5,000 plus gifts during our lifetime, or at least we can't afford to do it very often. But very many of us can afford to leave very substantial sums to charities when we die, even after we provided for our families. And booming asset values, so booming values of shares and property and stuff, mean that basically people dying now are much richer than their parents were when they died, and giving in wills has doubled in England over the last decade. So it's now £3.4 billion a year being left to charities in wills annually. And what that means is that if you take the amount of money people have given during their lifetime, they give a third of that amount in their will. So that's our big chunk of people's lifetime giving is through legacies. Church of England parishes got £60 million in legacies in 2019. That's an average of £5,000 per parish. Now, it's unclear how COVID affected legacy giving. There's likely to be a short-term increase, obviously just because so many more people died than in a typical year. So there'll be a short-term increase in giving because of COVID, and then it will probably kind of level back again, but keep going up. So it's a projection that it's basically going to keep going up by 5 or 10% a year for the foreseeable future, as more baby boomers particularly die and leave legacies to charities. It's very, very cost effective. So for your church, what do you need to do to legacy fundraising? Basically just mention it from time to time. So just talk about it either amongst yourselves, talk about it in sort of church meetings, whatever, like leave a legacy to your parish church that you go to. Really simple to do, very life affirming, enables people to feel that they've made a difference. You might want to produce a leaflet or a page on your parish website if you have one, to kind of encourage people to do that so they know what to write, and so that when they go to their solicitor, they can give them the right charity number or whatever. Now, legacy fundraising is not generally suitable for a specific project. You can't know that you get a legacy next year to pay for your heat pump. And even after someone's died, it can sometimes take several years to actually get the legacy in your church's bank account if the estate is complicated. But encouraging members of your church now to make provision in their will for the church in the future is an absolutely invaluable way of funding environmental and other big projects for the future. Really, really important to do. And there are some absolutely fantastic resources available through the kind of Church of England's website on that. And there's a really brilliant video that shows the difference that legacies can make to churches that I would definitely encourage you to show in your church, and I encourage people to think about that. And of course, start with yourself. If you've not yet made your will, or you've not made provision for giving in your will to your own church or to other causes, please do consider doing that. Next. Corporate support. People often think of companies are great sources of funds. The reality is just 2% of UK giving comes from companies. Okay. It's also not that well suited to capital environment projects, so things like installing heat pumps or solar panels, partly because companies like to give smaller amounts, generally £500 to £5,000, and they like to fund the whole project. So it's kind of their thing. Most particularly bigger companies doing corporate support love photo opportunities. So they like things that like there's a kind of a moment with you doing something with kids or whatever. And they're often quite focused on making a direct difference to the lives of their customers in a way that's connected to their business. So, you know, if you're a supermarket, often you're giving all these things like breakfast clubs and food banks because they're obviously connected to your core business that you do. So they're not, I wouldn't say they're the easiest, but there are companies that are interested in funding an environmental project. So I would strongly recommend checking wherever you live. Does your local water company have an environmental grants program? Quite a number of them do. It's also often worth approaching smaller or more local companies, and often they give things other than cash. So when I worked for a church, we had a big event to raise funds for a building project, which is very much a kind of church and community building. And we got loads of donations from companies for a kind of high-end auction thing. So we got one of the local garages, like, let's have a Porsche for a weekend for somebody to have as a kind of auction prize. We had a round of golf and a spa day from a hotel. We had dinner for two in a Michelin-starred restaurant, like all those kind of gifts from businesses. And we raised about, more than 10 years ago, I think it was about £12,000 from that event. Larger businesses with big operations in your area, so say you've got a big business that's got a headquarters somewhere near you, often looking for volunteering opportunities for their staff, because loads of companies now have staff volunteering days. So if you've got a labour intensive environmental project, so you're creating a wildflower meadow or something, that might well be an opportunity. Success rates are really high for local companies. So if you go and ask people, you know, can you support our auction event with a prize, can you, make a small donation or something, you'll probably get, if you go in and ask in person, you'll probably get 50% success rate with responses to that. If it's much more sort of big schemes, big charity of the year type schemes, much lower success rates for that. Public sector funding. The UK is really unusual because there's very little public sector funding for churches. So Germany's church, I'm going to depress you now, Germany's church taxes, so the money that's collected by the German government in taxes distributed to churches, 12 billion euros, which is 10 times more than the total income of all Anglican parishes. It's a bit depressing, isn't it? Anyway, there we go. So we don't have that sort of public sector funding that most European countries do. Environmental grants has not gone that well for the government recently. So there's the Green Homes grant thing that was set up a couple of years ago and was a total fiasco, and hardly anybody was able to access it. There is a bewildering range of grants available to businesses, some of which are applicable to charities, but most are not, to try and do environmental things. But there is a bit of light on the horizon. So there's a thing called Clean Heat Grants 2022, which is not announced yet, but in the pipeline, which will provide upfront capital funding for households or businesses, and we understand so far from the rumours that this includes charities, that integrate green heating technologies like heat pumps. So it is likely that from 2022, and this may be announced as soon as the next budget, that there will be some sort of grants or loans that have low interest rates or interest free that enable you to install things like heat pumps. It is also quite possible that there will be some government money going into the Church of England through the Department for Culture, Media and Sport that might actually help with some of these things specifically in churches. Again, not announced yet, but watch this space. Keep looking at their web pages that the Church of England maintains centrally to help you see whether there are government things coming along. Running out of time, I'm going to skip on. Lottery funding. This is here because it's halfway between government funding and trust funding. Two big lottery funds you've probably come across: the National Lottery Communities Fund, mostly fund kind of community activities, have been very focused on COVID-19 stuff recently. National Lottery Heritage Fund, mostly fund things to do with historic buildings, but also with people accessing and understanding those buildings. They're both very competitive, and they don't have any specific environmental funds in England. I know in Wales there is a bit more in the way of kind of wildlife related funding. And you need to show wide benefit to the community. So basically, the more sort of technical, like heat pumpy kind of technology your project is, the less likely it is to get lottery funding. But the more kind of community, engaging people, education, that kind of stuff it is, the more likely it is to get lottery funding. Again, we'll talk more about that on Thursday. Finally, trusts and foundations. This is what we think of, isn't it, when we think of fundraising? That's why I say it till last, to make you realise there's lots of other things. Grant making trusts are there's a wide variety of them. There are 8,500 in the UK, of which 1,700 were new in 2020. So it's a growing area. They give £2.7 billion a year, including 100 million a year to Church of England parishes. So there's a massive number of these trusts, and there are basically three kinds that you need to know about. So there's the formal philanthropic trust. So that is things like many of you will come across, things like the Garfield Weston Foundation, All Churches Trust. They have professional staff. They have a set of programs that they fund. They fund this, this, and this, and you make an online application after you've checked that the thing you want to do fits with their criteria. And a number of those will fund the sort of environmental projects in churches, including both of the ones I've just mentioned, but many won't. But at least it's clear when you kind of go into them and look for them, what they do. There are then many smaller ones of the same things, often local to your area. Again, they often have the same thing. They fund certain types of things, maybe a bit broader, and often the applications are in writing or by email. And we'll talk a little bit more again next time about where do I go to research and find out about those local trusts. Then there's corporate charities. So lots of the big companies give their money through a trust or a foundation. They donate, the business donates the money, and the charity then gives it out, and that usually reflects the interests of the business. They're often located to, like, connected to company locations, or if they're companies like Asda and Tesco and Morrison's, which have branches everywhere, they're connected to the things that they think their customers care about. They're often really keen, they're often keen for publicity, and I guess many of the same things we've just said about corporate donations apply. Then finally, there's individual donor vehicles. So there's thousands of smaller trusts that are basically just the legal mechanism by which individuals, often relatively wealthy individuals, give their money away. They're often not wanting applications, and they work proactively. And the way you kind of connect to those is the same as what we talked about in major donors. It's about building relationships with people in your area who have money that you think might want to give it. There's really brilliant and extensive guidance available from the Church of England, which lists a lot of the grant making trusts that support all sorts of different things, including specifically a guide to environmental grants that I've been involved in updating with Catherine and her team recently, that we will send you, I think, after the webinars as well as a PDF. And I've only got 8 minutes left, so I'm going to not say the other things I was going to say, and we'll take some questions.
Right, let's look at the remaining questions then. Thank you, Andrew. Oh, do you know, we're going to completely agree with the first of these, but I think it's important to say it. I struggle with the idea that environmental projects are not urgent, because they really, really are. If we don't act now, then things will rapidly deteriorate to the point of no return. Couldn't agree more.
Absolutely.
Do you think that by more churches doing environmental projects, we can put pressure on funders to recognise the need to do this work? So I guess there's almost a wider question there about, over time, are more funders understanding the urgency of the climate crisis and adjusting their funding accordingly?
Yeah, absolutely. Great question, Joe. And yeah, as you say, Catherine, I totally agree with that. You know, it is urgent. And kind of everybody knows it's urgent, but it's also that weird thing where it's like, it's not today urgent in an obvious, measurable way. And that's the difficulty. I think funders are recognizing it. And actually, to be fair to funders, I think if it hadn't been for COVID, there would be a lot more funding around in this area. But COVID obviously just had this, you know, kind of global changing impact on everything. And there is only a limited amount of, not just of money, but also of just attention that funders can give to the various different things. So I think environmental funding will come right to the top of the list over the next 2 or 3 years. And one of the things I think we should be doing, and what kind of one of my pieces of advice, we'll talk about this more on Thursday, is do the quick things first and wait a bit for some of the other things. So if you're you're here from a parish, you can change to a green electricity tariff tomorrow, and if you haven't done that, then flipping get on with it and just do it, because that genuinely will make a big difference to carbon emissions. And then actually plan your heat pump project, say that's what you're going to do over the next 18 months, and it's going to take a while to kind of get all your permissions and make it all work out what the costs are. During that time, the costs will probably be falling a little bit, and there will also be more grants available. I'm absolutely certain in 18 months' time than there are now. So do the quick and easy things that you can do now, and like work towards the harder things. And if you've not yet worked through the brilliant 2-page guide to what you should be doing, start at the top of that, like clear your gutters and all those kind of things. Do the easy things first, and by the time you get to the harder things, there definitely will be more money available for that. Second part of the question, absolutely. I think one of the things we need to grasp as the Church of England collectively is that we're going to have to not do some other things in order to pay for this thing. Because it's to go carbon neutral is probably going to cost us hundreds of millions, if not billions of pounds across the Church of England, and tens and hundreds of billions of pounds across society, maybe even trillions of pounds. And that's okay. We just need to decide what we're not doing. And we can each make that decision individually for ourselves. I'm going to invest in this thing for my house, and I'm not going to spend £5,000 flying my family to Orlando in the next couple of years. And that might be some of those decisions are really hard for us, aren't they? And we have to make the same hard decisions in the Church of England. I'm not going to build this extension to our church that adds another 300 tons of embedded carbon. Instead, I'm going to spend that money on heat pumps and insulation, even though it would be nice to have the extension in the new kitchen and whatever other facilities it might bring. So we're going to have to make and if we can make those hard decisions, then it will really help, because then we will be pushing funders, because the thing we'll be applying for is lots of environmental projects, and they'll be going, oh, this is obviously really important to people. We should be funding it. Great question though, Joe. Thank you.
I've certainly started to see some of the mainstream funders. So for example, the Heritage Lottery Fund have recently updated their environmental criteria. And it's really worth looking at that, because the Heritage Lottery Fund hasn't got a separate environmental grants fund. What it's got is, in any grant that it gives, it's got environmental criteria that need to be met to a higher or lower degree, depending on the project and the amount of money that they're giving.
Absolutely.
The next question is about legacy funding, although it was put in before you got to that slide, which was about should more emphasis be given by the church to legacy giving or funding. So I think you've probably covered that when you spoke.
Yes, Richard, yes, absolutely it should. We should talk about it. If there's one place we should be able to talk about the reality that we're all going to die, it should be in church, because it's a place that should give us confidence about facing that with compassion and kindness. And so absolutely, we should be better at this than anybody else.
And then there was a supplementary question attached to that about how easy or expensive is it to change a will to add a legacy?
Incredibly simple. If you're just adding a charitable bequest, lots of solicitors will actually do that for free for you. All you need to do is, probably for most people, all you would need to do is add what's called a codicil, where you just basically put in a legacy. If you haven't updated your will for 10 years, it's probably time to do that anyway. So having done a law degree, this is one of my things that I learned was you should probably update that regularly, because your circumstances will change. But it's not very expensive. And during the year, so National Make a Will Week, which I think is actually coming up about now, it's always in the autumn. Actually, loads of charities get together and run campaigns to encourage people to do that. And there's often, solicitors who will do that free or for cheap for you if you're leaving a legacy.
Now we've got 2 minutes left, including wrapping up. So quick ones. Is it tough only for churches or for all historic building funding applications?
Definitely for all, and possibly even harder for ones that are not churches, for ones that are.
Okay. Are there people who feel that lottery funding is blood money, since many people buying tickets can't afford them and encourages gambling? I mean, there are some churches who choose not to.
Absolutely, some churches do feel that, and that's completely fine. It's important to have ethical views. I guess my take would be, lottery, there's no evidence that buying regular lottery tickets really encourages gambling addiction. It's not like betting like fixed fruit machines and those kind of things that are much more problematic.
The next one is a comment rather than a question, so I think we'll skip that. And then there's a question about what age group you target for fundraising. Presumably that's for individual donations.
Yeah, so I think
really generous age group.
Yeah, so anybody, but do it in different ways. So young people will give to slightly different things and respond to slightly different mediums. So if you're doing it online, you'll like to get younger donors. If your main demographic in your town or village is older people, you might want to go about it a slightly different way. Much more on that on Thursday.
And the last one is a comment as well, rather than a question. Just saying it's a dilemma, knowing how best to develop our buildings to attract people.
Absolutely.
Thank
Yes.
you very much, Andrew. It is 1:30, so I'd better bring us to a close. Do you want to give a quick plug for Thursday's part 2?
So all the bits that you thought I didn't do today, I'll try and do on Thursday, but mostly the very practical, okay, I've got a project. How am I going to get the money in? How do I work that out? How do I tell people what we want? Who do I ask? How do I find them?
Lovely. So if you've got to the end of this one and thought, oh, but this bit wasn't covered, come on Thursday. If you haven't already booked, you absolutely can register for Thursday's webinar. And let me just find, oh, I've already put the link in the chat earlier on to our net zero carbon webinar, so you can get the link from there. Thank you very much, Andrew.
Thank
Got
you.
a huge amount of information from part 1 and looking forward to part 2 on Thursday. Right, let's bring it to a close. Thank you very much. And
Bye,
goodbye.
everybody.